All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get back to it. All right. Um, okay. So there were three different ways they really talked about this individual racism and how it kind of impacts humans. So you have the life course perspective, which is really just how health essentially changes over the course of a life. And that there was two major perspectives within this bracket, right? You had the cumulative disadvantage perspective, which is just health conditions are a result of personal and social stressors. So we kind of already know that, right? So this is just essentially talking about the fact that those accumulate, right? The more and more of those we experience, the more likely we are to have negative health impacts because of them. And then you have the weathering hypothesis, which is just that deteriorating health has more to do with long term exposure to unhealthy conditions. So these are like long term issues with maybe toxic water or long term issues with maybe the air pollution or even just living too near a landfill or all sorts of different aspects. Um, so then they broke it up into health and culture. So it's really talking about how US ranks low in health for a developed country, and that's in part due to our lovely for-profit medical health industry, which I'm going to try not to tangent on because I have a lot to say about it, and it is not necessarily pertinent to all of this lecture. We also have a poor healthcare system. Again, because it is for profit, it is not for the people. And so that leaves a lot of people with a lacking ability to have healthcare, have adequate healthcare, have the things they need covered, have insurance that um, is willing to not fight people to receive those options, medical options that they need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you also have things like the Hispanic paradox, which is really talking about the ways in which Hispanic, specifically immigrants that are coming into this country, tend to have better health long term than do those that were residing in this country or maybe some of the other groups of color. And that's really, I think, getting at the idea of the fact that there is this immigrant advantage, right? There's this ability for immigrants to come in. They have a specific, depending on how they came in, they have specific sets of cultural groups. They have a way in which that they are supported. And they also end up, because they're immigrating into this country, intentionally usually or by refugee status or what have you, they have a lot of acculturation, which means they're going to adopt the behaviors and preferences of the host society, including medical options for treatment and the ability to access medical health care that they don't necessarily have in the places that they may have been from, or that infrastructure might be falling apart due to war or um, uh, other political ramifications. And then let's talk about genetics for a minute. So the US also has a very long history of biological and racism, including really shitty science that comes down to trying to find genetic links to race. What we understand is that essentially genetics break down all the different parts of us, right? So we can find maybe a geographic region that an ancestor might have lived, or you can find specific phenotypes for specific features. The problem here is that the racial categories that we make in the United States aren't necessarily typical to one phenotype of noses or one phenotype of eye color or one phenotype of hairstyle or hair color or um, one specific geological region. Africa is a big place. So saying that everybody that has ancestral roots to Africa is Black doesn't work. And what geneticists are understanding is despite the fact that they can find very isolated geographic regions that might have something to do with, say, sickle cell anemia or like the Mediterranean fever disorders, right? That are related to a genetic code that are linked to a specific place. What they cannot do is take those specific places that all fall into a racial category because those are socially defined and make a like link it to a specific genetic component. We are 99.9% genetically the same. And that's across genders, that's across all of it, right? And the differences, the main core differences, are such a small part of the genetic makeup of a human that they're just not finding links that specifically make or break racial demographics. And that's because essentially you're going to see a lot more wide variety within a demographic than you are between demographics. And what I mean by that is, so the category of Black is going to include everyone that has a specific range of melanin in their skin, essentially, but also a wide variety of nose structures, a wide variety of lip structures, of eye shape, of eye color, of hair color, of how curly or not curly, or crinkled or not crinkled, or what way it lays, to all of these different things, to whether or not you have a receding hairline or not, whether or not you have balding, whether or not you have facial hair, whether all of these things are genetically variable within that particular racial category and all the racial categories, right? So, and that's why, and I'll get into that a little more when we're talking about one of the kindy chapters. But that particular, there's a graphic that I use in that I really love. It's puzzle pieces, and essentially the puzzle pieces are of a whole different bunch of pictures that are put together to kind of make a face. And essentially what it's getting at is this idea that you can't just look at one piece of genetic code and say this person is this race, because there are too many genetic variables that would be included in that racial group. And so if you still have questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask, because that's super important. And they also talk about racial categories not as being geographically isolated due to the fact that they're different depending on where you are. So socially, the US and how they understand persons of color versus how you understand them maybe in Brazil, or how you understand them in India, or how you understand them in China, right? All of those things and people of color and the different races are going to look very different depending on where you are at. And that's important. All right. Let's keep going, try to get through chapter 12, and we'll kind of go from there. So environmental racism. I put a whole bunch of different things in here. There's a really good link here to the John Oliver on environmental racism. He's funny and he's also ridiculously smart and has a really good writing team. But he explains things in a way that can be understood. And I think that it's a good idea, something to think about watching. The Flint, Michigan, and the racial health disparities. So Flint was also hit really hard with COVID. And again, that comes down to infrastructure, that comes down to the city you live in, the resources that it has. But there's a lot of conversations about the ways in which that Flint, Michigan brought up conversations about race and waterways that are really important, right? Our water is vital to our life, and currently we live in a world that is full of toxicity and full of waste and byproducts from manufacturing and byproducts from all sorts of different hold on, I found it. Well, I'll fix it later. Found all sorts of different hazards and chemicals that we don't need to be ingesting that we still kind of are. There is a lot of resilience for communities of color, especially Indigenous communities, as well as inner city communities, to the ways in which environmental racism impacts their lives, the way in which climate justice is directly linked to environmental justice. Unfortunately, that resilience and that resistance doesn't always fall on like doesn't always get the attention it needs, and it also doesn't connect in ways with everybody. So most people that talk about climate justice or talk about racial justice don't always link the two, and that leaves a disadvantage for a lot of people, because some of the core rights to live are impacted by climate injustice, right? And the environmental hazards such as toxic waste, pollution, water toxicity, the highways and cities full of air pollutants or impurities, pesticides, all sorts of other kinds of environmental hazards, because we're not even talking about nuclear waste. We're not even talking about some of the other chemical waste products, or the ways in which all of our water now has a specific level of birth control and a specific level of um, antibiotics in it, just because they can't be completely diluted out of our water system when it's goes through the water purification process and then comes back to humans to drink again. Um, there's also high hazards related to climate change. So ever growing weather disasters, as I watch the weather right now. Again, 2023 has already been an exceptional year for tornadoes, for wildfires. They've had some exceptional snowfall in California, and these things have provided and created cost of human lives, right? Because there's just not a way to necessarily get everybody in a safe place. Some people don't even have safe places as a part of it, don't have access to warning systems, et cetera, et cetera. On top of that, you also have raising water issues on coastlines. You have issues of mudslides. You have issues of lack of water in more arid areas. All of these things cause really big problems for local ecosystems, for local waterways, for local infrastructure. And that can have really long-term impacts for people, and is predominantly experienced by people of color. You also have things like lead poisoning that are due specifically to old processes that we now understand as not good, but they take a lot of economic resources in order to treat or to get rid of, and that's not always available to everybody. Environmental racism, or the institutional policies and practices that differentiate differentially, there we go, affect the health outcomes or living conditions of people or communities based on race or color. Again, living near power plants, landfills, manufacturing facilities, or major farming generally has an impact on your health. And these are places in which are usually developed for lower income housing options and things of that nature, or more rural housing, depending. 1.7 million in the US still live without proper plumbing facilities, and Indigenous persons are far more likely to be in this group. All right, let's talk about some environmental justice. We're not going to watch him right now. You guys can go back and do that when you want to. Environmental justice focuses on the right to live in non-toxic neighborhoods and or fighting the denigration of Indigenous lands. The Holt family was a family in Tennessee that won a rare legal victory, but had tragic health outcomes. They found some toxicity in their well water due to a local plant, and the EPA told them their drinking water was still fine out of their well. But then when a white family experienced the same thing in their well with the exact same toxin, the exact same levels, they told them it was not safe to drink. And so they ended up suing for the health outcomes, because this was years later, suing for the health outcomes. However, that also left them with a host of health problems, which wasn't necessarily obviously. If you had to garner yourself whether or not you could be healthy or have this legal battle that did come with a sum of money, you're still not gonna want to put a price on what your life is worth. And that's something that we need to think about even when we think about these legal victories. However, this was a really historic moment because this legal victory was a really big deal and hadn't been something that had been successful at other points. Indigenous rights movements are generally tied into, in some way, environmental justice as well. We're going to talk about that a lot more when we talk about one of the other articles. In the 1970s, Hyde Park, there was a battle over getting sewage systems, running water, and paved roads. In the 1990s, they had to fight yet again when factories moved in, and there were a lot of toxins and toxic waste that were brought into due to these factories. Many places started to understand the consequences of having nearby factories. However, that didn't, and that led to a host of different legal action. However, that legal action didn't necessarily come to really justice or any kind of positive change. Many places started to, okay, sorry, I already read that. There's still a growing debate over what to do with specific kinds of toxic waste. They're trying to come up with all sorts of things, even like setting it into space, sending it into space, doing. But a lot of what happens is that it ends up in the waterways or in the lands of countries that don't necessarily have the same standards. So you're going to see a lot of dumping in the Caribbean. You're going to see a lot of dumping in Africa. You're going to see a lot of dumping in the Middle East. And this has lasting impacts on their ecosystems. It has lasting impacts on their waterways and has done a lot of harm to the mental and physical well-being of these individuals. Again, we talked about Flint, Michigan already, but there was a massive amount of long-term damage that was done to this community due to their waterways being obstructed in the ways that they were and damaged in the way they were. And again, I could give you a massive amount of more examples, but instead I'm just going to leave you here with some of these articles that you can read to kind of do further deep dives into some of these topics. All right. So that gets us out of chapter 12. I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording here. And then we will get back into it in just a bit. And we're going to go over the 2 other articles and the Kindy chapters. All right. I hope you're having a great day and a great week.